Hey there, I'm really happy to be here with Lily Hibberd. Lily is in Paris at the moment. And for Niren, Lily will be undertaking a 1-month residency at Sydney Observatory titled Boundless Out of Time. Her creative research is focused on the pivotal role of time at Sydney Observatory and how the observatory establishment in 1858 was key to the transmission of European timekeeping as a practical tool in the colonisation of Australia. The observatory is, for example, the original site of the Meridian of Sydney, established in order to determine the hour and enabled an empire of regulated time to be distributed across the early British colony. Lily is interested in the gap between Eurocentric and colonial premises, as well as advances in technological determination and the reality that time itself is impossible to pin down and that time is always changing. She is also concerned that time, as we know it, on the planet is being affected, for instance, with the Earth's slowing rotation due to the shifting dispersion of water around the globe. Many challenges lie ahead for timekeeping. Outdated and empirical systems need to be reimagined. To be unbounded, Lily suggests, we may need to be out of time. Lily's residency will unfold in an open studio and laboratory situated at Sydney's Observatory. And Boundless Out of Time also activates the observatory through 3 collaborative performances we'll be talking about today. Participatory walk to remap Sydney Meridian with ice sculptor Kenji Ogawa, a female computers reenactment with researcher Tona Stevenson and Powerhouse Museum curator Andrew Jacob, and a live sound art event on time and displacement with artist Denise Beaubois and concert pianist Bernadette Harvey. Presented by the Powerhouse Museum as part of Niren. This project has also been assisted by the Australia Council. Lily lives in Paris and she's done many residencies that I know of and we've spoken about in the past, both working with scientists in the UK, but also in Paris. So, bonjour, Lily. Good morning to you over there.
Hello, Brooke, over there on the other side of the world. Here we are.
Indeed, here we are. Lily, I'm so happy to be speaking with you, and you know, it's difficult times at the moment just in regards to, of course, COVID-19 and the bushfires before that, but you know, you imagining and creating this artwork, or many artworks or kind of performances, enactments, etc., comes from many different places and very different kind of, you know, your own creative and scholarly and kind of, you know, your kind of really, I would dare to say, obsession and interest in time and science. And I'm just wondering if you could unpack for us all, you know, a little bit about yourself.
Well, look, first of all, Brooke, thank you for making the time to talk, you know, when we're all under pressure in different ways. And it's just so nice to see you. And I always love seeing you. And, you know, one of the richest things for me about Niren was definitely the approach it was taking to conversations, like right from the beginning, you know, that these are conversations between artists, creators, communities, and to enliven that space, you know, and this is why right now this conversation is really, I can say, vitally important, you know, for me personally. So thank you for that. And also for the way that you identified, you know, the observatory as this incredible, you know, pivotal place. Like, you know, it's always been there since, you know, we've both been alive. And yeah, that was an amazing pairing to make. And I feel still enriched by what I've learned, you know, since you commissioned that project, and the, you know, discussions will go on. So that's, you know, really been an amazing experience for me. Yeah. So thank you.
Oh, no, it's a total pleasure. I mean, Lily, I just get so excited by your practice, but I'm just wondering if you could start talking a little bit about painting.
Oh, yeah. Well, you know, various people like to sort of say, you know, it doesn't matter what medium you use, you're still a painter. And I'm not, you know, obviously it'd be nice to always, you know, continue to make paintings, but sometimes, you know, what I've found through my practice is that the things that you discover, the things that you encounter actually ask for different responses. So, you know, as my painting practice evolved into more performative and experiential things, anyone who sort of knows a little bit about what I've been doing since I'm an old lady, it's been a long process, but Yeah, so painting became about ways of discovering things, finding out things. So quite scientific in a sense, you know, even though you may not see it on the surface. And transformation of materials I'm very interested in. So that's definitely a thread through the projects here.
Could you maybe describe one of your paintings or one of your kind of painting styles so people get a little snapshot of?
So I'll probably put two examples side by side that were definitely, in terms of materials and medium, present in this current boundless out of time project. One is phosphorescent pigment, photoluminescent pigment, which Blinded by Light was probably a pretty well-known project where I used that in these paintings. So what happened, the idea was to actually make paintings emit light, but actually the premise, the reason I wanted to do that was to have paintings exist in time. So for something to happen that was like a film, you know, that it unfolded in time. So people may not know that, I've probably never talked about it before, but it's one of the reasons that I love and I'm still obsessed with this photoluminescent pigment, which, you know, is a material that was incorporated into a number of the performances in this project, which we can hopefully touch on. And the second body of work that is another background to this project as well is a series that in fact came up out of my residency at Musée des Arts et Métiers. I met this incredible...
And where is that museum? I'm just wondering if you could just describe the museum a little bit.
Yeah, Musée des Arts et Métiers is here in Paris. It's one of the old, well, it's apparently the world's oldest science museum. And it was founded in 1783 or something like this. I don't know the exact date now, but and it's Arts et Métiers is very much like Museum of Applied Arts and Science, the same principle that it brings together technology and arts and crafts into one single museum. So it's a sort of a history of technology museum, and it's famously houses the Foucault Pendulum of Leon Foucault. So I became, you know, I had this thing about ice pendulums, you might have heard, a little bit obsessive, but... and
what is that? What is the ice pendulum?
Well, so Foucault's pendulum is this amazing demonstration, you know, basically one of the things that's wonderful about science is that it can help us understand, you know, how things work, okay? So for everyday ignoramuses like me, one of the thing that the Foucault pendulum demonstrates is the gravitational rotation of the Earth. Now, back in 1851, when he first did his demonstration at the Pantheon, which is not up the road here, people like didn't really believe that the Earth was turning, right? So, so this basically you stand in front of it and the pendulum is swinging like this. It looks like it's swinging in a circle, but in fact, what is happening is that the Earth is turning underneath the pendulum. So if you stand there long enough, you see this slowly moving ellipse shape, and it visibly is the Earth is turning underneath the pendulum. So Foucault had this idea and he made this object, and I thought, well, that's actually very artistic. You know, this is what artists love, you know, these kind of things where there's something hidden away and you manipulate it or you paint it or you build it or you perform it, and it is transformed into something you can feel or see or perceive, you know. And so for me, Foucault is a kind of artist. And so I thought, you know, and then sitting there, I was thinking, well, there's time in here in a really interesting way, you know. There's time on one level, which is called the arrow of time. That's time as it kind of goes forward, yeah. You can't reverse it, you know, problem. But there's also this time as a cycle that goes around. So we have days, years, you know, we have this idea of cyclical time, this very human experience of being stuck on this planet. As long as we're going to be stuck on the planet, we're going to have that sort of sense of it. So, you know, I'd been doing all this work with ice for an exhibition, and at that time in 2009, so in time here, at an exhibition at Grant Peary, which was called First Love, which was very much focused on desire and time. So the sense at which, you know, as humans, we have yearnings to exist. We have the sense of we want to control time on one level because we fear it, but we also desire it. We desire future, you know, so that it was a kind of more speculative philosophical project. But, you know, in the Foucault sense, I wanted to make it. So I had this piece in that show that was these huge blocks of ice. And in fact, Kenji doesn't know this, but he helped me out because he doesn't remember it so long ago. But I wanted to
tell us a little bit about Kenji then. I mean,
Kenji Ogawa is in Sydney. Actually, a lot of artists know him. You know, he's a very well-known ice sculptor, and he does a lot of these kind of grand, you know, pieces on the harbour. But he's also worked a lot on issues of climate as part of his practice. And so when I just literally wrote him an email and said, you know, look, I'm wanting to develop this project. It's about the effects of, you know, the shifting dispersion of water on the planet. Kenji was like, oh, yeah, I'm in. I will work with you on this, you know, it's fantastic. I mean, Kenji's, you know, now he's, I think, 69 years old, and he's survived, you know, very serious illnesses. But he's just an amazing, the most kind of generous human, like really a beautiful soul. So, you know, we've one of the things about these projects is you get to work with these people that you just think, oh, I love them, and I love the way they think about the world and what they do with their with themselves and with others. And, you know, he's a special man.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering if maybe you could kind of touch on just about the scientist you're working with. I think was it in Edinburgh?
Yeah. So this is the my first work with what's called extreme light. They're a quantum optics and physics, so experimental physics group, which at the time were based in Edinburgh. Now they're in Glasgow, led by Daniel Lefaccio. And I was working in 2014 at the Musée des Arts Immédiats. I had this. It was, you know, centered on Foucault and the pendulum, but also Foucault, other works of Foucault. He developed the first accurate measure of the speed of light. So I was sitting there, and my partner, who's a physicist, I was like obsessionally asking him, but why can't we film light, you know, like, because he works in photonics. So I was asking him, why can't we capture light flying, you know, why not? He's like, you can't do it. No one's invented anything. There's no way to do that. Forget about it, he told me. And then he went to a conference, and Daniel Lefaccio was presenting. And Daniel Lefaccio was presenting on another topic, but he said, look, we've got this really exciting news. We've developed a camera that's called a SPAD camera. It's it actually is it's like every other camera, but it has an array of captors. So you can capture up to 20 million pixels in a femtosecond. So just like very large number of fast shots that are then, because this camera takes those shots and puts them in order, you can make a film. So basically this was the thing I'd been thinking of. And so Cristiano went up to Daniela, who knows, you know, afterwards, and said, my partner's got this crazy idea. And maybe you want to work with her. And it turns out that Daniela, you know, wanted to be an artist, but, you know, smart, went into physics, made money, had a stable career, but never let go of this thing. And he always takes photos of these projects, you know, like he loves photography. So we struck up a kind of collaboration, and I went to Edinburgh, and he flew one of his postdocs over who speaks French, and we worked together here and developed work for that exhibition together. And then a year later I thought, well, you know, I really enjoyed this collaboration, and so did he. So I said, well, we'll apply for some funding. And we got a Legal Film Trust grant for me to be artist in resident in their lab. So then I spent good part of a year going over there and actually just sort of hanging around them like an annoying artist, not understanding 99%. But,
I mean, but this is so exciting. I mean, just, you know, I mean, collaboration is so much part of not only your visual arts practice, but your life practice, really, because I know that you've worked on other projects, you know, the Paragirls project, you know, with the other collaborators, up there around trauma and memory, but also, if we're coming back to, the project for Niren, you've been, working within the museum itself. I mean, this is the Powerhouse Museum, which is it's affectionately titled, but it is the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences. And I was just wondering, now launching, into Sydney, into Niren, I mean, you've got, I think it's 3 different projects, really, that kind of encapsulates your work for the Biennale. But could you maybe just talk a little bit about the collaborative, kind of experience and how you've kind of managed to bring these people in?
Yep. I mean, I can put up a slide maybe of one of
let's
the projects. Do you want me to share my screen or?
Yes, please.
Okay, let's see. There we go. Share this one here. I'll just go full screen. Okay. So I might talk about this first. So this is a project that focuses on the role of what are called the female computers at Sydney Observatory. And instantly, the moment that you called me up and said, would you like to work at Sydney Observatory? I went, well, I actually was already only vaguely aware of this, this history. But I think I was about to talk about this project that I ended up doing with the Observatory of Paris as a kind of second side project when I was working at the Musée des Arts Métiers, because I came across this amazing woman called Suzanne Debaba, who is not the first female astronomer at the Observatory of Paris, but one of the first to be recognized as, a qualified astronomer.
Yeah.
And we developed a collaboration together, her and I, and made a film for that exhibition. But basically over a year and a half, we delved into the archives of the observatory, which she'd done a lot of work on herself, to draw out the history of the female computers, the calculatrices, they're called in France. So this history in Sydney is in fact a global history of the effort to map all of the sky, all the stars visible up to 12th magnitude, which is a certain size, but basically brightness. Obviously with the telescopes we have today, you can see many more stars than you could in 1880 or 1890 when this began, this project. So it was a French initiated project at Paris Observatory, and basically Australia joined in as one of the few Southern Hemisphere observatories to do basically a very kind of colonial thing, which is mapping, right? Cartography, wanting to know and pin down where everything is on a grid. Even if you'll see in this image in the middle, there's a slice of one of these images. In fact, it's a glass plate, which is in the collection of the Museum of Applied Arts and Science, or the observatory's collection. So that's a piece of the southern sky. And what's really amazing about those plates is that they're some of the first photographs of the southern sky.
Get to see some of these plates. I mean, what were some of the objects that you actually saw in the collection, and which people did you work with?
So Tona Stevenson was one of the first. She she used to be the manager of the observatory, I think for a decade, and she did her PhD on the subject of the female computers whilst she was working there, and she realized this incredible thing. She did something that I am quite jealous of, to be honest, but she worked with other, obviously, staff and curators like Andrew Jacob, who I'm also collaborating with in this project, who's a curator and also an astronomer himself, and researcher at the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences and the observatory. So between the two of them, I wrote to both of them, fairly soon, even before, really my project had got rolling, and said, I'm the kind of person that doesn't just research by myself. I need to work with you, and I would love to collaborate with you. And they both went, great, this is fantastic. So, but what Tona realized when she started to find out about these women, and really no research had been done on it, and she's still working on this topic herself. So this was really after the observatory was closed down. Basically it stopped functioning as a research institute and became like a public museum. But so projects like this effort to the Carte du Ciel, it's called, or the Astrographic Catalogue, which were two projects that were run in parallel out of the Paris Observatory, were basically just dismissed, like deemed to be, well, a huge failure because they never finished either of these projects, like anywhere in the world. They ran out of money, and because of you know, different new techniques of astronomy, radio telescopes and things like this, basically these kind of old observatories were either torn down, they were shut down. A lot of their telescopes were sent away, and in this case, the astrographic dome was destroyed, dismounted, and in fact, kind of just given. Macquarie University said yes to taking their collection, including the many thousands of plates, which had never been digitized or fully catalogued. So anyway, Toner went about sort of gathering this material together to find out where it was, to start to catalogue these plates and bring them back to the collection. And she managed to find the dome that had been removed, and it was in a field all beaten up somewhere, some Macquarie property.
Okay, so is this like the original dome of the observatory?
It's one, so it's not one of the original, so the main building of the observatory has two domes. Yes, that's right. We do have a picture here, although it's a bit hard. In fact, there you can't really see them, unfortunately. But the observatory itself has two domes. One was built right at the beginning, another one was added later. And then this third dome was actually built in the 20th century, specifically for the astrographic catalogue. And the telescope was brought up from, in fact, Melbourne eventually, the astrographic telescope. So Toner, once she found the dome, basically raised a whole lot of funding, and she had this brilliant idea to create an accessible dome to recreate the original, on the original location, which was just by the gates of the observatory, the East Dome, they call it. But in this case, the funding came out of disability and access funding. So basically they consulted with a historian and an astronomer called Andrew James, not confused with Andrew Jacob, and who is differently abled, and he consulted with them extensively, and they created a dome that people who, you know, can't climb the stairs. Basically, the problem with the main domes of the observatory is they're inaccessible to anybody who can't climb a set of narrow stairs. So this is a fantastic idea. So that was one of the sites that we were going to present this work. Did you want me to go back?
So when you said we were going to present this work, I mean, obviously at the time of this recording, there is the COVID-19, you know, is affecting so many, you know, artist projects, etc. But in the future, you know, hopefully this will be still presented. And what does that mean for you? Because I mean, a lot of all the projects you're doing at the Powerhouse Museum will be participatory, or you know, kind of looking at the kind of the mapping of even early time. And it's really great to see the female computers and that kind of history and kind of tracking down the dome. But I'm also kind of wondering, you know, if we go further back, the actual creation of the observatory itself and the way,
Yep.
You know, I mean, Australia was never mapped in a Western science medium before. And this is the first time. And I'm just wondering if you could share a bit about that project. Because I remember us talking about it, and you were just incredibly passionate. And I was like, for trees, for me and my own research, hold so much power for Aboriginal culture. But also, it's also about the destruction of land, or the keeping of certain trees for certain events such as this.
So one of, you know, when you think of institutions like observatories, we often think, well, you know, it's really about stargazing. It's something very beautiful. And this is true. I mean, and, you know, studying the, you know, our cosmos is such a fascinating and wonderful thing. But there's also other aspects and reasons why this observatory was established were quite particular in 1860, 1858. So, in fact, William Denison, who was the governor of the time, who put the money forward, which is the important thing, you know, when you build a new colonial building, there had to be funds from the government. So the governor of the time, Colony of New South Wales, instituted the observatory, not for the pleasure of stargazing, or this became a kind of capitulation later on. At the time, it was to disseminate time, you know, so they needed to be able to know what time it was, and they needed instruments to do that accurately. And then through the time ball, this wonderful ball, which we could see in the early image, would drop.
So what's the image of then that we're looking at now?
So this is a composite collage sort of thing I made to put together a few different elements of the research that I was doing. So the third reason the observatory was established was to establish a meridian. So what you see here in this image is a number of pieces that refer to the way that that functioned and its role in Sydney. And as it happened, you know, I've previously done research into meridians, the Paris meridian, and because these are closely tied with time, not only timekeeping, but the way that we calibrate, the way that coordinates and measures are made of space and territory particularly. So, you know, I mean, I can sort of go into that a little bit more, but in this image here, we've got a composite of the kind of mapping of the stars. This is one of the plates that the female computers were using to...
So I'm just wondering, Lily, could you use your cursor to make point to the different objects or components of composition? I
can actually draw even better. Look. Ooh. Fancy. Okay, so we have this. It's a red pen. We have this grid, and basically that was the piece of, this is the plate, the glass plate, which was used in this was the part of the female computers project. But it's this idea of having coordinates, you know, so when we look at a map, we know we've got a set of references that tell us where things are in space. So the same idea was used to map the stars. It is a similar idea in the 19th century, you know, that we can map the Earth, and we know not only where we are, but in order to map the Earth, we need this thing called the meridian. We need to have a starting point, a line drawn somewhere, and everyone's aware of Greenwich as that starting point. So what we have here are these three, see, I'll draw very well, three, you know, sets of coordinates, and, you know, anyone who likes Google Maps will have seen that you have these coordinates that tell you where you are on a map. But the bottom left is actually it's how a meridian is calibrated from, this is the position of here, the 10 hours, 4 minutes and 49 seconds is the Observatory of Sydney, in counting 10 hours, 4 minutes and 49 seconds from Greenwich. Okay. So basically at this point in time, you couldn't go anywhere on a ship unless you knew what time it was. Not only what time it was where you were, but what time it was from Greenwich. So they had these amazing clocks that they carried on those ships, and including the Beagle and all these famous ships that arrived in Sydney's harbour.
So you talk about early British colonial time.
Yeah. So in the middle here, and this is the third element in this image, is in fact an image that I've clipped out of a photograph of what are called survey reference trees, more popularly scar trees. Another type of a reference tree is a glazed tree. And these were, they can still be found, although I think maybe the bushfires wiped out a few of them, scattered throughout regional areas of all over Australia. This is a sort of a continent-wide system. It was a system also used in Britain and in America, and integral to the process of mapping out and plotting out territory, and of course deciding who owned it. So as a colonial tool, it's completely fundamental. So I can run through a few more images in this series.
Oh, that would be great. I mean, I think that, I mean, it's really fantastic to see your thinking here, this composition you've created. I'm very curious, as I'm sure many people are, about this history of
delete these.
Oh, yes.
Otherwise they're going to be on every picture. It's kind of interesting, random. Anyway, there we go, that's better. So I'm just going to skip through a few slides here because this is prior work that, you know, informed my thinking and research. So this is Greenwich Meridian, called the Prime Meridian. So that I will refer to this again when we come back. but that's back in 2011 when I was working on this. This is Paris Meridian. So people might know a little bit that there was this competition, of course, you know, people like to stereotype it as that. And in fact, it's about who controls time. And Greenwich, as we know, sort of won this argument. This is the...
People probably don't know about that. And I think maybe if you could just quickly touch on it, especially because it affects Sydney in your project and Sydney in that marking time. So this competition between the French and the English about who owns the beginning of time, or the...
So if we're going to have an empire, you know, basically, there can only really, you know, a global empire, can only really be one. That's why we still got these fights going on, no? About who really rules the world. And interestingly enough, you know, I mean, I was well into my research when I came across a writer called Giordano Nanni. He's based in Melbourne, who's done written a couple of books on the topic of, you know, the relationship between time and empire. It's a subject that broadly, you know, has been researched, but I really wanted to dig in and find out, well, how did this actually work in Sydney? So I, you know, the history of the relationship between England and France is a little bit of a sidetrack, but basically the French were integral to developing this, this technique of mapping through triangulation. So you can see, I'm going to draw again, running through the center of this map here is this sort of band. And basically, I can't really zoom in very easily, but I've got another few images, in fact, that might help explain it a little bit better. But basically there's, they set up these kind of towers, or they sometimes use lights on top of hills to measure out the distance of the map, like to know, because the problem with the Earth is that it's not a perfect sphere. It's actually kind of a bit squishy and there's uneven territory. And to accurately map the land, they had to use a meridian, which is this is the Paris Meridian. It's a quadrant of the Earth. And in fact, that's how we have the metric system also came out of this measurement. So they needed to in order to map the land, to know where the distance things were from each other, they used this triangulation technique. Okay. So I'm just going to clear that and go to the next slide. Okay, so this slide here, sort of why I put these two images together. In fact, this is both France, but I really couldn't find an equivalent set of maps for Australia, but the same process would have occurred, where basically you start with the spine running down the middle of down the meridian, and the whole continent, or country in this case, can be triangulated and completely mapped out.
Okay.
And this is how land boundaries are figured out. And you can see like a more detailed version as you kind of continue the process, like mapping out. So that's Paris Meridian, just to show that there's basically a fantastic walk you can do through it, which gave me the kind of notion to, well, why don't we create a walk down the Sydney Meridian, just to explain where that performance concept was derived from. So it's something I've actually done here in Paris. Yeah. It's an invisible line. It's not something you can see. Yeah. And one of the most important things to know also is that these meridians have moved. They're no longer where, if you get your GPS out and you take the original coordinates, which is one of the reasons for those coordinates on the first image, is that in fact they've been displaced. So this is a common kind of throughout all of the research I was doing for this project. What I kept coming across is that, you know, it's all very nice to say that these are absolute, these measures, and that they're fixed in time and in place. But in fact, it's unbounded. These things cannot be controlled in such a way that we would hope. So I'm just going to skip forward. This is an old image from the 16th century of a triangle, just so people can understand, well, how is it done? So basically,
so hence the title, you know, part of the title of your work, Unbounded. I mean, is this something that, like, again, that's like no one can control time? And I remember when we talked about Niren and even the meaning of the word Niren, meaning edge, you're kind of interested in, well, how far does time go? Is time important? Like, what is time? What is the human concept of time? And yet there's this kind of obsession, and as you say, it kind of helps map territories and colonialism and power.
I mean, they really are not only oppositional, they're kind of in conflict with each other. And I think that the experiences we've had in the last 3 to 6 months tell us a lot about how little control we have, you know, and that this is actually quite destructive, you know, that we're kind of trying to, you know, in trying to pin down everything, we're actually completely losing touch with what it is. And I'm not saying I know what unbounded actually means, because I think it's a pretty vast question. But these contradictions are what interests me, and like, you know, and I'm not undermining the fact that we do still, of course we need maps and we need to know where we are. I'm not trying to say that we throw it all out the window, but maybe try and understand how we got to this point of this belief system and why maybe it isn't working for us as well as we think.
So here we're fast forwarding all the way over to Sydney in early British period, Port Jackson.
Yeah, 1853. So we're well into 60 years, you know, of the early colony. But they had a lot of trouble mapping because of the problems of not having an observatory. Basically meant there was, and even once they did have an observatory, and you'll see I've got a few illustrations of this, once, even after the establishment of the observatory, there were big problems in how they could be sure of what time it was. And that led to them having badly mapped boundaries. Some still exist today. So this is an early survey by Mitchell, well-known people, Sydney, Mitchell Library, lots of streets named after this guy, who was a Surveyor General of New South Wales. And you can sort of see here, I'm sorry, it's a bit small, but yeah, there's some, you see these triangulations going out from that's, you know, Sydney Cove there, this is the observatory.
So that's the water, isn't it? This
is the harbour, yeah.
This is the harbour.
Yeah.
And where is the Opera House?
There. Can you see my cursor, or do you want me to put a pen on?
Yes, we can see it.
I can do the fancy pen here. There we go.
Well, there's the Opera House.
This would be the Opera House here. Sorry about this bad drawing. I haven't got control.
Where the Museum of Contemporary Art is, and then Cockatoo Island is around the corner. And then, of course, the observatory is not far from Sydney Harbour. When you say the heads, so the heads are out.
That's the observatory there, and these are the heads. So you can see there's a triangulation there, yeah?
So the heads, this is the east coast. For those of you who don't know Sydney, I mean, that goes out into the Pacific Ocean. If you keep going east, you're going to hit, well, you won't hit New Zealand, but you have to go a bit southeast for that one.
This is a boat. It looks like an umbrella, but that's see how good an artist I am?
Yeah.
Look at that boat. Fantastic.
Yeah.
Anyway, I should draw. That's definitely not on the cards.
So the mapping that you're talking about, and this kind of the marking of trees and, or there's Kent Street in Sydney.
Yeah. So this is this is 1833, and this is really at the beginning of the colony starting to be like carved up in plots or parcels of land, they called them. So you see here there are names, you know, and one of the things, I just actually noticed something yesterday when I was doing this slideshow for you, that down the bottom here, I'm sorry, it's very small, but I'll read it out. It says here, and this answers your question about this will lead us to the trees. It says here that the scale of the map, because we want to, you know, 1 to 1 or 1 to 100, whatever it is, and usually it's metric, right, for us, except for in America, of course. But here it's 2 inches equals 1 chain. What is a chain?
So
One chain.
What is the chain that they're referring to?
Yeah, they're referring to, and I've got a slide in here somewhere which I might be able to skip forward to. I'll just clear the drawing. So when they were determining the boundaries of these properties, they in fact, this predates the Sydney Meridian. So they were using a process of triangulation of basically using a theodolite, which is a tool to know where the meridian is in the sky, like when is it midday, and these things called what the Gunter's chain is one type of chain, but basically it's a chain of 100 links, and I've got an image of it in here somewhere, so I'll just skip forward. But anyway, that plot of land is right behind the observatory, so that is Port Phillip, but these were barracks basically before it was an observatory. So I've just pulled a few maps together to show how the land was being apportioned at this point in time. This is one of the first trigonometrical surveys, so a proper survey, and surveyors might be tuning into this session, I don't know, a proper survey. The land is quite a scientific thing. It's not, you know, and you see probably people have seen out on the side of the road, you know, groups, maybe 2 or 3 people with a tripod sort of thing and a funny little machine. These are surveyors. And today that tool combines all of these several technologies into one instrument, which in 1865 they didn't have.
And I think it's fair to say, if we go back to that map Redfern, I mean, it's been an Aboriginal, you know, stronghold and site of resistance.
Yeah.
an invasion in the frontier wars, and of course wiped out a lot of the Gadigal people through smallpox, but also through guerrilla warfare with Pemulwuy up and down the Parramatta River. So there's a lot of other pretty brutal war, you know, really going on in Australia during all of this period.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of, you know, and in mapping, we're wiping out, you know, all of this. So maps, you know, whilst they might sort of serve on one level, you know, and in serving a certain set of knowledges and a certain ideological kind of, you know, it's not only about laying down a grid, that grid, in fact, kind of erases. So literally, you know, I mean, I had this, you know, the walk for me was also about casting yourself back into a dimension, a space in which there were these trees, you know. So we're coming to the trees, which really became really important.
We're excited about seeing these trees.
Yeah. I'll just track back 1 second to, you know, this is the dome, actually. Here's an image of one of the domes at the observatory on the left here, or you maybe on right. As it is today, that's a photograph I took when I went out for a site visit just after being commissioned. And what happened is that I stood there, and this is what happens to, you know, to people, you know, when you do a research or when you're an artist, suddenly something leaps out at you. And this was what provoked me. This particular moment when I took this picture was really what set off the chain of events to think about why fixing a meridian is a questionable thing, and actually an impossible thing, because it's not bounded. You can't bound space and time in this way. What you have here in this image, and I'm doing all my fancy drawings, are these two slots here, right? And these are actually, and the reason for the image of this lovely man, astronomer underneath the telescope here. This is actually a Meridian telescope. So the function, this telescope sits, in fact, still today underneath that shutter there. And so that's the idea of that shutter, is it opens up and you can look straight up at the sun. So the purpose of this particular instrument was to know when midday was. They used it for several, they also used it for lots of other things. But, you know, basically when a star or the sun tracked right overhead at midday, there was a little machine that they could press a button and it would write down that exact moment, you know, on a mark on a piece of paper or a chronograph.
But of course, that happened after the kind of the mapping of the trees, though, didn't it?
No, this was sent. So this process of using the trees, which I'm about to kind of explain in a bit more detail, was a technique already being used, but it was extremely inaccurate without having an idea of the time. One, so you had to know. They could measure the midday meridian through the theodolite on the ground, but they needed to know where they were in relation to Greenwich. And the only way you could know where you were in relation to Greenwich was to have a local meridian that would count it out from that. So the Sydney meridian became the main reference point for the whole mapping of Australia at this point in time.
And when you say the whole mapping, it's also mapping of time as well as land, is it?
So the meridian is known because, you know, when you have a star pass overhead, you can calculate exactly what time it is, but you also, out of that, you can determine, you know, this line through space, through the territory. And you have to have an absolute line through space, but also then you can count the time against it, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. So if you don't determine a point, which can't just be a dot, it has to be, you know, when we carve up the earth, basically, we've got these meridians. I mean, one of the reasons, to go back, that the problem with France having its own meridian and Britain its own meridian was that everybody had these different calibration systems. And as soon as you had global shipping, you know, it wasn't about the ships crashing into each other, but you wanted, basically, there had to be one system for everybody. That was the whole idea of this. So there was a convention, and the French were very unhappy with this, but the British the Greenwich Meridian was established as the 0 point in time and space around the world. So we have all these time zones as a consequence.
So little planet Earth in the entire universe, Greenwich Mean Time is the center of time as humans know it in its dominant form.
Yeah. So this is it's not only an ideological thing, it's a very practical tool for domination. And that's exactly what played out in the colony. You know, these tools allowed the government to basically claim land, plot it out, and say, well, it's mine now, and I'm going to give it to this person. So the process of dispossession was mechanized in this way. But what struck me as I stood here is that you've got these two shutters. And I actually asked Andrew Jacob right there and then, well, that's odd. Like, why is there two of them? Did they move? Because the meridian has to be on that line. I mean, that's where it's meant to be today, there. But in fact, it's actually over here, according to, there's a little thing we're going to see in a minute, which is called a trig point, which is a trigonometrical marker. So why is there a shutter on the left? And I'm like, oh, weird. Maybe things aren't fixed, you know? So, I mean, we'll get back to this if we have time, but moving on to the next slide, I'll just do that. I'm just going to skip all of this. So these are Meridian clocks. So basically, you had to recalibrate the clock according to when the star passed over, or the sun passed over, which changes every day. I mean, these are, you know, the rotation, the speed of rotation of the Earth is a fluctuating thing. That's also built into the third, you know, sort of line of research in this project, which looks at displacement and the displacement of water around the planet and its effects on time. So this is literally, like on the left here, we can see the Sydney Meridian, and this is that transit telescope underneath the shutter. It's actually a Google Earth map. So I started using some of the instruments. In fact, we could argue that they're very problematic instruments for mapping that we all rely on, you know, quite without thinking today, to actually find out more about where was the meridian at, like had it moved, was it where we said. So this became the basis for a walk that we would do, and that I'm working on actually making as a virtual walk experience right now, that tells the story of his whole history whilst walking, but also whilst attempting to remap and position ourselves in relation to what was meant to be a fixed like Greenwich Meridian, which is also the joke is that it's now in a park near a rubbish bin instead of being in the middle of the telescope where the meridian would be measured.
And is that because the Earth has obviously shifted?
The number of factors, I mean, people don't actually really, there's a number of theories out there, you know, and I went and met up with a surveyor I went to Amsterdam and met a surveyor who was fascinated with this subject also. And in fact, in Australia, and it's sort of something I was going to come to at the end of this, there has been in 2020 a whole new set of techniques for what they call datum, which is actually the mapping of coordinates, because the Australian tectonic plate it's moving all the time. Like the plate that Australia's continent sits on is drifting, they say drifting, is moving northeast by up to 7 centimeters a year. So this is displacing literally and it's something Dennis Beaubois and I have been working on together, researching tectonic plates and this kind of dissonance, planetary dissonance, you might call it. But this is a kind of bit of a statement about the premise of the walk. So the idea was to emanate out of this transit room and attempt to follow the line that it draws through space, through Sydney's territory, which, you know, crosses through important, significant sites and spaces, but also if we can reimagine it back in 1858, you know, that was populated by, you know, what they could use to mark land were these trees. So I have some images that explain a little bit about this. So in fact, you know, we can say what they call longitude, which is the meridian, was in 1858, in fact, measured by transit of the moon that he observed through that telescope that we saw. And they determined that it was 10 hours, 4 minutes and 49 seconds from Greenwich, which in terms of coordinates is 151 degrees, 12 minutes and 15 seconds. These are arc seconds. So, so this walk was developed around the same notion that these trees would have, or the trig stations, the idea of having points in space that mark out the line. So each one focusing on a position in a coordinate. So the idea was to see how it's displaced while trying to walk. We know that, in fact, we're no longer, you know, you could use your phone if you want, but basically I went on to Google Earth and walked this line and discovered that, you know, yes, it's not in that position, no longer in that position, but nor was it historically. So this mythology that we've got that it's always going to be the same and never going to move doesn't stand up when you go dig into the archives. And so I started going right through every sort of record book and annotation that I could find.
This is at the museum that you were doing this research?
Yeah, partly in consultation, but mainly just digging into what I could find, you know, by looking into archives remotely.
Okay. So this Trig station, are these, can you maybe describe what this image is that we're looking at?
Yeah. So I used, in fact, the archives became like kind of the subject or material for the posters, and these posters had each a position on this line that I had determined. So that's how I got the coordinate, but it's also where we were going, where you would go on this virtual walk. So on the right in the image down here, this is actually the screenshot of where I was in space, literally as I walked this line. So starting from right here, and if you're in that room, in the transit room underneath the telescope, in fact, you see this triangle that is right underneath it. So this is a trigonometry station. And these are vital to cartography and mapping. So basically you set up a trig station and it's a reference point from which you would then take a theodolite and make your next trigonomical measure. So the one in Sydney was being used up until, so that particular survey that you can see here is 1966, but in fact they were using that trig point, which the real one is on the roof of the observatory above that instrument, next to the time ball. And they were carrying up their instruments and basically, you know, still using it until the 1980s when the observatory was closed down. So, you know, these are some instruments that were being used early on. It's one of the older instruments at Parramatta Observatory that is a repeating circle. So it's basically the earlier version of the instrument, the transit instrument, which was portable. So one of the things I found was that, so here we are, you know, like few stations down the road. And in fact, when you're at this station, you can see on your left Sydney Opera House. Now, it's a beautiful place, pretty iconic, but I discovered, in fact, what they determined was one of the first meridians they were using was calibrated out of Fort Macquarie, which was there on that site. So this image in the middle is from the museum, from the Powerhouse collection, and it's an image of the fort where it was. So these, you know,
the Opera House was.
Yeah.
Well,
so that's where the
house is, I should say.
Yeah, that's where the Opera House is today. Was on that location. So these kind of significant. One of the other things that First Nations Australians are very well aware of is that a lot of these sites that become iconic are actually significant for other reasons. And Parramatta is one of those places also, you know, that was a very significant site for women, for the Darug women, a birthing place, and a place for women became Parramatta Girls' Home. So, you know, these things come around, and I don't know if there's anything more significant to that site, but it's interesting to me that this became the location when the Beagle, Captain Fitzroy with 22 chronometers arrived from, this was the big, you know, the ship that the Darwin was on, Charles Darwin, on this expedition to kind of count all the species to determine knowledge through this kind of Eurocentric lens, what happened on this location. So this is where they basically landed on this point, and they took out their instruments and they determined. So often in Sydney, we're told that the first observatory, you know, was like just below the one we have today. But in fact, the kind of observatories were everywhere. The French set up a little observatory in Botany Bay. So all this idea that there's kind of a single history and one, one determination that stays fixed forever is complete.
And also the Opera House, of course, was, you know, it's called Bennelong Point. I mean, there's a history around the Aboriginal man Bennelong, who, you know, left Australia, went away and came back, etc. But also Parramatta was the first site of the active removal of Aboriginal children, which is of course the stolen generations as we know it today. So the direct people in the Gadigal and other mob around there have been dealing with these kind of intergenerational traumas and histories for a very, very long time. And it's kind of interesting how you mentioned that there are other observatories, in inverted commas, happening with the French, with the English, but other sites of significance. Yeah.
And let's not forget that for First Nations peoples all over the world, that observing there was being tuned in to the universe is like a core thing, and it's something that has not been forgotten. To the earth, to not only the earth but the stars. And one thing that if you go and spend any time in a remote community is that you realize that you are the subject of the universe because you see it, you feel it. And so this whole sort of mentality actually makes us blind, like physically blind. I don't know the metaphor for that, but we're bounded in it because we just have no idea how to live without it. I'm not saying that we throw our phones in the toilet and no longer use Google Maps, but just to say, well, maybe we can think, maybe this isn't working very well. But so I found a quite ironic article written by a New Zealand, because they love to take take the piss out of Australia, but here we go. So I found a piece written in 1903 by the, I think he was the colonial timekeeper at the time, Thomas King. And he made a note of the fact that, and this is in 1903, that Sydney's meridian had been recalculated like multiple times, and there were errors. And these errors led to big issues in mapping and determining time. But because everyone was saying, well, Sydney meridian is the longitude of Sydney is our reference point, we're all going to use it. Even New Zealand was using it as their reference point at the time. So you can see that it's like kind of, how sort of totalizing this whole technology was.
It's very political. I mean, as was colonizing. And he's just part of a tree.
So here we are. I'm going to try and explain. I mean, I'm not a surveyor, and as far as I could get to understand, how the trees were used. I dug around a fair bit into surveying, history. And then I discovered that Museum of Applied Arts and Science has a few of these. This is a Glazed Tree, and it's the only one I can find, but also the survey reference trees in their collection. Because I wasn't there on the ground, I wasn't able to go into their archives, but I'm very keen to be able to do this one day, and maybe we can do that together. But this is the only reference tree in their collection that has an image that has been put onto their database. So this is slightly different to the image that you saw at the very beginning, but basically these and Glazed trees were used slightly different to survey reference trees. That survey reference trees literally had these kind of code. There was a whole kind of language or a system of coding.
And I think that you do have a photo of that, don't you, of the reference tree? What does Glazed tree mean? What does blaze mean?
Yeah, so these blazing, it was called, and I think I've got an image of it actually how it was done, but in fact the image that I've got is I think they're actually using burning the tree. But basically a Glazed tree, as we can see here, was where they, I mean, I know that any conversations I have had with people like Dobby, like people straight away go, oh my goodness, I mean, this is from an Australian Aboriginal perspective. Dobby is one of the artists in the Biennale in Niran, who's a musician, and we started having these conversations around this walk as a kind of collaboration. So in fact, I've been sending him snippets of writing for a rap song. So we're going to see where that goes. But, basically...
About Niran, everyone's talking to each other, and I'm glad that you're explaining Dobby, because also MC Chronic, worked with, Mohammed Baressa, along with Nadine, who's an Egyptian-Australian hip-hop rap activist, etc., the same as MC Chronic. Yeah, it's just really lovely, all these kind of connections.
Yeah. I mean, he, was like, in terms of meridians, you've got them everywhere, for first, in First Nations people, this understanding of space and time through memory, and mapping is done in it's not done in this kind of cartographic, fixed, possessive, where you have songlines are meridians essentially of some kind, and there's another word for that. And this is something we were exploring together kind of in parallel. So the Glazed Tree is literally like, there's different methods, because the survey reference tree, which I'll show you an image of in a minute, is actually, like I said, it had a particular set of codes, and they were used, and I've got another image that I can show to explain this, but the Glazed Tree were used for like when they run, say, there were markers in to determine a certain amount of, I think it was like 10-mile markers or things like this. So major markers were these Glazed trees, and they were literally like a huge star cut into the bark. So you can see here, they've pulled it off. This is what they have in the museum, this object and the sign, so the surveyors consider this to be a hugely significant history from their point of view, and that one is being lost. So we have this kind of, one thing that came up in my mind is, the collaboration that I did with Curtis Taylor in 2012 around the telephone booths. Is it kind of interesting parallel here, in that Telstra people that we spoke with had a really kind of like, they consider these phone booths to be a really significant kind of perspective of technological advance through the bush, and it's a great thing.
I was just wondering, can you just tell us who Curtis Taylor is and what Telstra is?
Yeah. Telstra.
Telstra.
Curtis Taylor, I'll start with Curtis Taylor because it's far more important. Curtis Taylor is an amazing Madu filmmaker, and he and I collaborated on a telephone booth project. It was a commission from Madu Mili artists and the Fremantle Arts Centre. So we went out to
he's in Western Australia.
Madu is Pilbara region of Western Australia. Vast. Madu live across a vast terrain. It doesn't just count the Pilbara, because that's
so it's quite a remote Aboriginal community.
Northwestern, and an amazing, beautiful place. Yeah.
And Telstra is the main phone company technology, telecommunications company in Australia.
Was telecom.
So
telecommunications. I mean, the thing is that we got into, Travis and I, also a whole lot of research together. He's interested as a filmmaker in, how, like technologies are taken up in remote communities. So it was really the perfect, like I sort of went out looking for someone to work with on that project, because I didn't want to go out there not knowing anybody, or, I wasn't presuming that I could talk about the experience from the community perspective anyway. So we collaborated with Madu communities. We spent several months going in, to those two communities that his family were living. And mostly people were saying to us, well, that's really, who cares about the phone booth? I mean, it's boring. Why do you want to talk to us about that?
But it's really interesting too, because if we look at this one here, this tree, Glazed Tree section was from Mulgoa in New South Wales in 1936, and of course, like the phone booth, there's a markers around the place, and so the next slide.
This image here, yeah. So I do see it like you. There's a network. We're talking about a network. So the trees became a kind of an information network for surveyors, and I have further down an image of a map that sort of shows a piece of land and how it was used. So on a smaller parcel, because it's kind of gift, right, of land that they were apportioning, a crown land, these reference marks were used to mark out the boundary points of a piece of land. So because the tree was already there, some people would be aware of this technique through the little white piece of wood you see in the ground. But if you go out into country Australia, you're bound, they're sometimes marked in the stone. Like I did find a few images of these when they were surveying for making roads. There was sometimes, but more often not, trees were in abundance. So in my mind, if I shut my eyes, I can see not buildings of the streets of Sydney, but these, kind of trees, this strange sort of network spreading across the colony.
And And of course, this is Crown property. So when we're talking about Crown property, it's obviously the British Empire, and still today, it is referred to as the Crown, the land.
Yeah, Crown land, absolutely. So, you know, there we have the broader arrow, and, you know, it's something we recognize from, you know, convict uniforms, and like Jonathan Jones' current project, he's been using this kind of symbol. And I hadn't really thought about it. I thought, you know, I understand as prisoner wear, but I don't. Then I realized, then I looked into it, and the broad arrow is actually a mark to say we own it. It's like, you know, branding it literally.
Okay, so this broad arrow is a symbology of ownership of the British colony, and that's why it was on the convict uniforms.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, well, I think. I mean, this is.
Well,
You
yeah,
know,
it's a very.
we get a historian in to tell us what they think about it, but it's interesting. I mean, it does mark property. So the bodies of convicts were property. I mean, yeah, to be used.
Of course.
The way they wanted to use it. But interestingly enough, so then I discovered that in the Powerhouse collection, there were a number of these trees that they've taken, you know, peeled off or cut a section away. So the image on the left is in fact one I found on a surveyor's website, who decided that he wanted to do a sort of mini kind of, you know, story and document a few of these trees that they were finding as they went around, you know. So it's
have a picture of them actually marking a tree, like, or a etching or something.
Yep, there's a drawing by S.T. Gill called The Survey. This is from an illustration from a book called The Australian Sketchbook, which is in a number of collections in Australia.
With the research you've done so far, how far out were these trees marked, or these stones, from Sydney as a point of time?
All over, like everywhere, the whole continent.
Oh, so all over Australia?
All over Australia, yeah.
And what does that mean, though? Could you maybe just explain the 101 of that? Like, like, could people go to one of these trees and go, okay, well, that's what the time is then?
No, it's not actually about telling the time. It's strictly about determining land boundaries and parceling out land. So if a survey today is badly done, a big fight breaks out with your neighbours about who owns which piece of the veggie patch, where the fence goes, you know, basically.
So for dummies like me, when we're talking about green miniature, GMT, and then of course we're talking about surveying now, what is the relationship between the two? Yeah.
So, well, there's a pretty good example of where it can go wrong. Let me just go down a few slides, and these are here. So it's a kind of a joke. Like, I found it pretty funny, but it's still today on the border of South Australia and Victoria. There's the dog's leg, and this dog leg exists on maps today because of an error in the trigonometrical survey, due to the fact that the earlier fundamental meridian of Fort Macquarie, as you see in this quote, was not correct. So this, you know, basically my kind of assertion that, you know, there are errors, that these boundaries are shifting anyway on the Earth, stands up and is still today marked on a map. And there was a fight that went on and ended up in the courts, which basically, I think Victoria, it's about, I think it's about 3 miles, you know, sorry about talking in miles, but that's how it was back then. Difference that Australia, you know, that Victoria stole from Australia. So I'm pretty unhappy about that. And that was because, so it's not about determining time, it's about, you need to have your meridian fixed really well in order to absolutely determine space, land boundaries. So they were referred back to this by counting. So there were 2 ways to do it. You could either carry a clock or around this time they started to use like signals. So there were signals being sent, and eventually Australia was interconnected straight into through underwater what do you call it, communications cable, sorry. And yeah, so that you could have an instant relay of time, which if you knew, so like I say, these things are completely codependent. So you need to know what time it is in Greenwich, because that determines knowing, you know, that line is the starting point. It's the 0 point in time. So But locally in Australia, they weren't directly connected to the UK. So you either carried clocks on the sea or you made a local meridian and you assumed that you knew the difference back to Greenwich to know what time it was everywhere, because you have to, it's like about having a single determining system.
You know, it's so fascinating, Lily, just how impressive and how certain creative projects have extraordinary research looking at history and the kind of meandering that artists like yourself do to kind of try and unpack, well, what, you know, what was actually happening in Australia. But I'm just wondering, before we kind of wrap up this and start talking a little bit about, you know, what's going to happen in, you know, hopefully in the next 5 or 6 months, is there anything else that you'd like to kind of say about this marking of the trees and what we're doing now, that you're talking about now?
I think, you know, to sum up, I mean, this is an example. So this is the situation we're in now, which is that, you know, Australia's out of, you know, this sort of notion that, you know, we can fix it with a new technology is really one of my big questions. You know, I mean, we've got this misaligned map problem in Australia, and one of the factors that has cropped up in my research is in fact that one of the effects that is happening on planetary timekeeping is the shifting dispersion of water around the planet. So it's not only tectonic plates are moving, it's not only that GPS means that we have a different coordinate. So where you might map on the surface, GPS allows us to know where the center of the Earth is. So that is one of the theories about why Greenwich Meridian has moved 100 meters when you go there with your phone and use GPS. But the third reason it may be considered a minor effect, but even a minor effect is an effect that we must take into account, is that the distribution, the shifting distribution of water around the planet that's occurring, you know, with the large melting of ice sheets, not only the poles, but basically like major bodies of water are moving to different parts of the Earth. And a lot of that water is moving into a more around the equator, which is partly because of the pull of the moon, you know, it draws water into this particular zone. And that is having an effect which has been mapped, has been calculated by various like NASA research projects on the rotational speed of the rotation of the Earth. So it also has had an effect on where the pole is positioned. So there's an aberration in the precession of the Earth. So this was a kind of part of the third project, which was actually taking that data and converting, using it as a way to make music, basically. And
I'm just wondering, could you maybe unshare that screen?
Yep.
And then we can both. Here we are. Here you are. Hello.
We're back again. Enough slides.
Oh no, I mean, it's just so extraordinary. And I just think, you know, like a project like this to happen in a Biennale for, you know, an artist to, you know, be able to work with collections. Often there is so much research, there's so much collaboration that when people go and experience, for example, this Meridian walk, you know, in the future, or, you know, come to the performance, you know, with you know, the you know, different collaborators. Often people don't see like the whole backstory or, you know, this kind of immense research. And I was just wondering, yourself as an artist, I mean, you're knowing your trajectory, and it's become, would you say, more, not even research based, but kind of, I don't know, it's too easy to say scientific, because, you know, you've launched from, you know, early colonial mapping of Australia and the impact of that to, you know, the gravitational pull of the water around the Earth.
Yeah. I mean, that's where the ice pendulum came out of anyway, you know, this kind of 10 years, 12 years ago. So they're, you know, but we're finding out more about our planet. You know, the good thing about technology is that it gives us a vision, right? Because it's the satellites that are being used to, you know, which Trump would love to kill off this whole program tomorrow. but basically the satellite technology that allows us to know where the bodies of water are moving, and NASA has had a central role in that. And to, you know, I'm not, there's so much, you know, going on with climate, you know, the climate crisis that, you know, I mean, obviously everyone's kind of going to have to come back to this question pretty quickly, even though we're distracted at the moment. But they're all interwound, you know, like how, you know, are we as humans not only going to, you know, go on living well, but how, you know, what is our role in this planet, you know, which, yeah, these are kind of, sometimes, you know, it may seem a little bit abstract to talk about time in relation to the climate, but I think that we're talking about fundamentals, like we exist in time, you know, we have this small period in which we are here and present on the earth, but the earth, you know, is also a body. It's a kind of, you know, I mean, some people talk about Gaia or spiritually in this way, but, you know, one of the kind of senses I was interested in like taking things that are mutable or fragile like ice, is that, you know, we get a sensory connection to our planet, not only, you know, as a kind of abstract entity, but as a body, like a thing that if we can grasp it, we can understand that, you know, we can't control it. There is something beyond the scope of our imagination, but it's still, you know, it is an entity that we can grasp and can care about. That's one of the sort of, I don't know whether you call it a philosophy, but it's a kind of ethos for me, you know.
And I think it's so fascinating because when you do talk about this kind of, well, the proposition, really the proposal is, you know, the British may have won the competition, but that whole concept and practice is very recent in humanity. And really you're saying this kind of this idea about, you know, kind of the water and the environment. I mean, we cannot really map that because we can only really map our own being within that, with the cause and effect of what humans are actually having on the environment. And it's incredibly fascinating. And, you know, Lily, I can't wait to speak with you again, you know, when some of your projects are realizing. And I think that this is what's so wonderful about, you know, about Nirren, is that, you know, there are many projects like yours that happen at different times, you know, inside the Biennale kind of, you know, venue, I suppose, space and time, like, funny that, like, you know, from 14th of March to the 8th of June. And of course, the Biennale is closed at the moment, but hopefully it will reopen later. But it also means that, you know, certain aspects of walks will continue. You know, it's like Randy Cutler's, you know, salt tours will continue. Andrew Rewald's garden will continue. I mean, there are many other projects from, you know, program as well. But I just want to say thank you so much for sharing your extraordinary research.
No, I mean, it's like, I know that there will be many more conversations because with you and I and with the, all the people that I've been working with, because, you know, these histories aren't done when you have a date like 8 June. I mean, there's like, this is a fascinating, like, it's opened a whole chapter for me. I mean, you know, I mean, I had sort of worked in various places all around the world on various pieces of this that are in this project, but it's really brought, you know, it's united a whole lot of thinking and fascinating. Like, I completely, it's the beginning of something that were really, amazing.
Well, thank you so much, Lily. It's great.
Thank you, Brooke. Thank you.
Okay, bye.